I've always been absolutely intrigued by all the possibilities that VR has to offer in the future. For example, just think about it. You could visit any place you wanted to without ever leaving your bedroom. You could meet new people without ever stepping outside your front door. Or you could see a sunset on the other side of the planet without ever having to leave your hometown. It's really, really amazing. But one of the really intriguing ideas that I've always been fascinated with is the possibility of using your computer without ever actually having a physical monitor. Just having everything in a VR headset and being able to have everything around you be your workspace. It's a really interesting idea that I've always been fascinated by. So I tasked myself with a single challenge. I wanted to go one single week, no monitor, no physical display of any kind, just my computer, my VR headset, a keyboard, mouse, and that was it. So, this is my experience trying to work 1 week in VR. Now, before I even began this experiment, there were a couple things I had to get out of the way first. First, I obviously needed some rules to abide by for this entire experiment. I want to make sure that I had something that was pretty solid and that I knew that I could follow and refer to in case anything went wrong throughout this experiment. First rule is pretty clear. I won't allow myself to use any physical display. That means no monitor, no TV, no projectors, nothing else that I can physically see. Second is I'll allow myself to use any VR headset that I have at my disposal. For the sake of this experiment, I decided to go first 3 days in my Valve Index, and then the final 4 I went in my Oculus Quest. The third and final rule is that I won't allow myself to use my laptop throughout this entire experiment either. This was more just to make sure that I wouldn't go to my laptop rather than stick it out with my desktop and my VR headsets halfway through. So I decided to put this rule in place so that way I wouldn't be tempted at all. The only exception to these rules is I would allow myself to use a monitor or my laptop if, for whatever reason, I just simply found that I exhausted all my resources and I just couldn't get a VR headset to work. But those were going to be my only rules. With my rules out of the way, now I need to move on to actually making sure that my desktop and my VR headsets were all set up for this experiment. So for this, there were a few things that I needed to do. First is I need to make sure that my computer could actually boot into the desktop pretty reliably most of the time. I did find that the best solution for something like this is I had to disable my password. And I know, that's a huge security issue and you should never disable your password on your computer. I wouldn't encourage it. However, after quite a while of researching how to get past that whole login stage, I finally came down to the conclusion that it might just be best to disable my password altogether. And the reason for this is I obviously need to make sure that I can get into my desktop and then have all my VR headsets start up reliably from there. So that's pretty much why I ended up going that route. Second thing that I needed to do was also pretty simple. I need to make sure that my VR headsets would actually boot up and be able to connect to my PC once my PC booted up. For this was kind of simple. What I needed to do is I needed to make sure that SteamVR would start up every time I start up my PC. And this happened after the login stage, which is also why I had to go through and disable my login. And I also need to make sure that applications like Virtual Desktop started up reliably, which honestly wasn't a big issue. Virtual Desktop just had a little checkbox that all you had to do was click and it would automatically start up. The final issue actually came down to working without a monitor. Now, most of these applications, such as Virtual Desktop and SteamVR, don't actually create a virtual monitor. What they actually do is they mirror what you're already displaying out to a physical monitor. Obviously, this was an issue because one of my rules was I would not allow myself to use any physical monitor. So, I came to this. For those of you who don't know what this is a dummy plug. And what this does is this tricks our computer into thinking that there is a physical display plugged in, even though there really isn't. This one specifically tricks our computer into thinking that the monitor plugged in is capable of either 1080/60 or 4K at, I think it's 17 if I recall, but I may be wrong. I'll have a link to this, by the way, down below. But the nice thing about this was this was a pretty cheap little product, and it allowed for me to the potential to hook up as many virtual displays as I would like just using these little dummy plugs. With that, my experiment was all set up. So I got to disconnecting my monitor, I got to removing my laptop off my desk, and I finally got to plugging in my dummy plugs. And with that, the experiment was all set up. Now, I ended up disconnecting my monitor and removing my laptop the day before I actually began this experiment. So on day one, when the date finally came and I was finally staying at my desk, I cannot believe how empty my desk was, how much room my monitor actually takes up on my desk. My desk looks so empty compared to how it usually looked with a monitor hooked up onto it. So I was honestly pleasantly surprised, but everything just looked so clean and organized that way. It was honestly really refreshing. And honestly, that was probably the only positive of day one. On day one, I had the most peculiar issue whatsoever. Now, I'd actually set up SteamVR weeks before to boot up anytime I started up my PC, but for whatever reason on day one, when I actually started this experiment, SteamVR did not start up. I actually spent a good period of time trying to troubleshoot this and finally went to my Quest 2. And what actually ended up happening was I logged into Virtual Desktop using my Quest 2 and starting up SteamVR that way. And for the life of me, I just couldn't figure out what caused this issue. For whatever reason, SteamVR just didn't start up on day one. So after I started up in Virtual Desktop, I closed down my Quest 2 and swapped back to my Index, and everything was working fine. My best guess at this time was that perhaps SteamVR was doing some kind of update and it prevented it from actually starting up. But I was never able to confirm or deny that because without a physical monitor, I wasn't really able to diagnose any issues, and that became a really common issue throughout this whole week-long process. I never realized how much I actually missed a physical monitor throughout this week. Now, when running this experiment, I actually ended up getting 2 dummy plugs because I wanted to try and see if I could even run 2 monitors at one time rather than just a single one like I usually have. So what I actually did was I plugged in both these dummy plugs, and I actually spent most of day one just kind of trying to set up my environment. I went in and I found that SteamVR's own desktop interface actually wasn't very well optimized for 2 monitors. For whatever reason, and I really don't understand why, but you're not able to pass a physical mouse cursor between the 2 monitors. You have to actually take your whatever controller you're using in SteamVR and click on that monitor in order to actually move around that mouse using a physical mouse, which was a really peculiar thing that I didn't even know was really a thing until I actually began this experiment. So I actually ended up switching out the SteamVR's own desktop menu for OVR Toolkit and XS Overlay. I actually ended up spending a lot more time in XS Overlay, but I also spent some time setting up a very simple environment. I would not use SteamVR Home, however. I honestly thought that it would not be the best experience, especially given that I use a lot of Unreal Engine. And when Unreal Engine's running, it closes down SteamVR Home anyways. So I actually ended up setting up so that way in the SteamVR interface, in that little loading area, I just gave myself a pretty nice little environment. I also ended up opening up XS Overlay, scaling up my screens, and this was another huge thing that I ran into as well, was that seeing things like text was not so easy using the Index. I actually ended up having to scale up those monitors to about double their size before I actually got to a pretty good spot for me personally. And that was a very, very unusual thing for me to actually see and not be able to look at text on a website or a Word document or anything really like that. And this is also where I ran into the first issue with a SteamVR headset specifically. Now, most SteamVR headsets rely on external base station tracking. One of the few exceptions to something like that being something like the Vive Cosmos. So, I obviously had to rely on external tracking. But the issue with this is because of where my desk was positioned, I didn't exactly have the best tracking experience. I actually had occasional issues where my display would all gray out or where I'd get little stuttering, like my base stations were just having trouble tracking where my headset was. So it became a little bit obnoxious, but I ended up finding a somewhat of a sweet spot at my desk where I didn't have as much of an issue. It did still pop up occasionally, but I'm sure if I had my base stations positioned a little bit more correctly for this kind of setup, it probably wouldn't have happened quite as often. Now, the big mistake that I made at the end of day one, however, was I decided to try some standard flat screen gaming. And boy, let me tell you how that went. Now, I actually decided to try and open up Borderlands 3. And there was no particular reason. I honestly didn't expect for any bad experience. What actually ended up happening was shortly after starting Borderlands 3 and loading into the main menu, my whole headset lagged out like crazy. And it actually got to the point where my right eye would actually start blinking black, like it was turning off and then back on again. Like it was just struggling to keep up with me running both Steam VR and Borderlands 3 all at the same time. I had no idea what was going on with this. Now, day 2 did not start out quite as bad as day 1 did. This time I actually was able to start up my computer and my index, no issue whatsoever. SteamVR started up just fine. I started up my computer and a few minutes later, my index lights turned green, showing that it had joined my computer and everything had worked just fine. And again, I threw on my headset, there was no severe issues. Now, because Mondays when I get the bulk of my recording done, I already knew that on day 1 I was going to be in Unreal Engine at some point during that day, and I'd be working on some kind of tutorial. I don't remember what tutorial I was working on that day, but I did remember I was working on one, just as I expected. Now, I don't know for what reason this happened, but on day 1, I started up Unreal Engine and I had the same laggy issue that I had with Borderlands 3 the day before. It was the most odd thing. I've never had this issue before. But oddly enough, I did manage to find a solution. I actually went into the NVIDIA control panel and I reduced the resolution off of both my virtual displays from 4K 60 down to 1080 60, and everything went fine. So after a while, I finally ended up getting it all working, and my whole experience was honestly not too bad. After I'd reduced my resolution to 1080 and I was still running at 60, everything was working just fine. I had no issues further with my virtual monitors. Day 3, again, for whatever reason, SteamVR just didn't boot up. This time when I started up Virtual Desktop, my computer was nowhere to be found, so I was just kind of left in just kind of a shock. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to switch over to my laptop because I wanted to finish off the experience, saying that I had never touched my laptop, I'd never touched a monitor, and I'd never touched any other physical display. So I went over and did the next best thing, and I restarted my computer. And oddly enough, my Quest 2 did manage to pick it up that time. Then a few minutes later, my index finally connected as well. It was a pretty odd thing. Now, again, like I said, throughout the whole week, I have no issue, I have no way of troubleshooting any issue that I have because I don't have a physical display. If something goes wrong between me actually pressing the power button on my computer and my headset starting, I have no way of knowing what went wrong. So I just kind of let it be and went on my way with day 3. Now, day 3, overall, wasn't really bad. Now, I noticed by this point that despite my wanting to use only my keyboard and mouse, I was still finding myself relying on my standard controllers more often than I really wanted to. For example, when I wanted to start up my virtual monitors, they don't just start up when XS Overlay starts up or when OVR Toolkit starts up. So every time that I boot up my monitors, I actually need to use my controllers in order to actually get my desktops visible. Now, I also had the most peculiar issue on this day as well. And again, this is another one that I can't say for certain, but I do have my hunches what caused it. But on this day, I ended up opening up 2 instances of Unreal Engine. Now, the first one opened up no problem, and because I'd already worked out my issues with my virtual monitors the day before, maybe 2 days before, everything seemed to work just fine. However, when I started up the second instance, my headset randomly rebooted. Like I said, I have my hunches for this, but because I don't have a physical display, I have no way of knowing for certain what actually caused this sudden reboot of my index. Now, going into day 4, I decided I was finally done with the index. I'd had so many issues that I'm pretty sure were specific to either SteamVR or the index itself that I was kind of becoming a little bit tired of it. And while I was getting adjusted to using a VR headset, it still wasn't stopping me from straining my eyes looking at text all day long, or from the little issues such as the index rebooting, or other little latency issues that I run into the few days before. Now, going into the Quest 2, one of my first concerns was actually with quality. Now, this was a concern of mine for a couple of reasons. One, at the time that I started this day, I didn't know what the resolution was like on the Quest 2. I didn't know if it was going to be better or worse than what I had seen on the Index. I was actually expecting for things like text quality to be even worse than what I'd experienced on the Index, and that I might actually end up going back to my Index. The other thing too is that, like I said, I'd be using Virtual Desktop for a lot of this. And so with me using Virtual Desktop, I was expecting for a wireless stream to be a little bit worse, maybe even have a little bit of annoying stutters periodically. So that was kind of my expectations. And my expectations were immediately shattered. Going into day 4, I was actually really surprised. One of the first things that I did was I opened up a website and I ended up Googling something completely random. And the quality was amazing on the Quest 2. It was so much better than what I had experienced on the Index. It wasn't perfect, I won't say that, but it was significantly better than what I had seen on the Index. I was actually able to read without having to squint my eyes and having to strain my eyes or lean forward to try and read what was going on. I was able to look at it and actually make sense of what all those pixels on the screen meant. It was so much better than what I had experienced with the Index. Now, I won't say that day 4 went perfectly, however. There was 2 issues that I had run into on day 4. The first one was hand tracking. I thought that hand tracking was going to be my saving grace, my option away from controllers. I honestly was hoping that this would be my option, so that way I wouldn't have to use controllers, that I could leave it somewhere else and just use hand tracking when I needed it. But no, Virtual Desktop had other ideas when it came to that. When I booted up Virtual Desktop and I started actually getting to my keyboard and mouse, I actually found that my natural position where my hand sat at my keyboard, Virtual Desktop thought that I was trying to click on my virtual monitor when my fingers got too close. So I ended up having to take that away, since it was also occasionally taking away from what I was doing with my mouse and just making it a little bit more difficult to navigate. It was honestly really disappointing to have to disable hand tracking. I ended up having to leave it disabled for the remainder of the days. But I'd really hoped that that would have been the final way that I'd be able to ditch controllers, and unfortunately, not quite there. The second issue is I was also hoping that, given that the Quest 2 was such a good quality for something like this, I'd hoped that by using the Quest 2, I might be able to get a more wireless feel, something that's a little bit more freeing than having to stick to a cable. But no, unfortunately, the Quest 2 also had a little bit of that issue, but not quite as bad as what I had experienced with the Index. Because the Quest 2 occasionally needs to recharge, I occasionally had to plug it into an outlet, or I had to plug it into something like a rechargeable phone battery. So, while it wasn't perfect, it wasn't quite as bad as what I had experienced with the Index, and having the option to be able to move wherever I wanted in my environment was really free. With the use of the Quest on day 5, I'd finally started noticing that I was transitioning so much better to working in a VR environment. The overall experience was significantly better than what I experienced on the Index. I finally found myself actually staying in the VR headset for longer periods of time than what I had, because I wasn't running into constant latency issues, or I wasn't running into my headset rebooting, or any sort of issues like that. Everything just worked so much better on the Quest 2. With the Quest 2, I had no problems with staying in there for longer periods of time. I wasn't straining my eyes just sticking in them. And I was still pretty comfortable using a keyboard and mouse as I had been on the Index. That whole transition period seemed to carry over pretty smoothly overall. I did occasionally, of course, have to check between the notes piece on my Quest 2, but I wasn't finding myself having to do it quite as often as I had when I first started this experiment. Now, of course, it wasn't all perfect. There were, of course, at this point, a couple major issues that I had started running into. The first one was my Quest 2 getting pretty warm. Now, I was still able to go for probably a few hours before I actually had to take off my headset. It wasn't until later on that afternoon that I had to take it off for extended periods of time. But because of how hot it got, it just became very uncomfortable to wear and use consistently. The second thing was actually a very peculiar issue. It was the first issue that I came across that I just had no explanation for. And it was the first probably major issue that probably would have kept me from using the Quest 2 to begin with. Now this issue actually happened near the end of day 5. I was actually about to go to bed at that time. I was finishing up some video editing for a video that I had coming out, and all of a sudden I had a really weird issue with Virtual Desktop. All of a sudden, while I was working there was a sudden stutter, which wasn't a big issue. I'd had stuttering before, and I could handle occasional stutters that make sense over a wireless connection. Then all of a sudden, my mouse stopped moving. Yeah, it was the most peculiar thing. My mouse just randomly stopped moving. I don't know why. Then all of a sudden, Virtual Desktop popped up and said, no more, that there was no connection. Nothing whatsoever. So I opened up the menu, went over to the computers tab and refreshed. My computer showed up. It showed up just fine, exactly as I would have expected. So I clicked on it. There was no connection. It said that it was trying to connect and just couldn't. So I was like, okay, that's a peculiar issue. So I tried clicking on it one more time and nothing. So all of a sudden, I was debating my options. I had actually been considering at that point maybe even swapping over to my Index, seeing if I could get my Index to reboot. At that point, it was later on in the day, so I'd probably have to restart my whole desktop, but it might have been an option to get around this issue, when all of a sudden, Virtual Desktop shut off. My whole screen went black and I was back in the Oculus Home menu. It was the most peculiar thing. Now, during this time, right above the little taskbar, there was a little notification that came up saying that Oculus Link detected my PC. So I figured, okay, that's peculiar. Let me try one more time with Virtual Desktop, because I do like using Virtual Desktop. I think it's a little bit of a better experience. So I opened up Virtual Desktop, and nothing came up. Nothing at all. No PCs, nothing. So I refreshed my page. Didn't come up again. So I refreshed it again, and this time my computer came up. I clicked on it, and again, it didn't connect, but rather, Virtual Desktop shut down again. So at this point, this was a very peculiar issue, and I swapped over and decided, you know what, let me give Oculus Link a shot. I've not tried Oculus Link, so maybe it might even be a better experience than what I was experiencing with Virtual Desktop for a flat screen experience. So I switched over to it, and lo and behold, the Oculus Air Link worked just fine. Now I'm going to wrap days 6 and 7 into one another because day 7 was rather short and I didn't end up doing a whole lot on day 7, so most of this was done on day 6. So throughout day 6 and 7, most of my issues had been solved at that point. I'd found that Virtual Desktop had even managed to handle flat screen gaming much better than what SteamVR had. And I can't say for certain what the reasoning was for that, but Virtual Desktop just overall seemed to have a much better experience. I didn't have any issues with all of a sudden my Virtual Desktop cutting out because the game just was not capable of running over a wireless connection like that. I didn't have issues with my Quest suddenly lagging out because it's a standalone headset. Unless the headset itself is lagging out, there's no issue there. So the only thing that could possibly limit me is that stream. So the overall experience was significantly better, and I ended up spending a lot of day 6 and 7 just kind of experimenting around with a lot of flat screen games to see if I could find anything that terribly broke my experience with Virtual Desktop. And no, everything worked just fine. The whole experience was significantly better than what I'd experienced on SteamVR earlier on in the week. Now, I didn't end up sticking with a null monitor setup after this experiment for what should probably be most of the obvious reasons. But this whole experiment was honestly really amazing. I genuinely enjoyed my entire time doing this experiment. I was honestly genuinely impressed with how well the Quest 2 had run. The Index wasn't a terrible experience. It's just that I think it's only for a very specific group of people, depending on what you want to do. For example, I wouldn't recommend it if you really enjoy gaming and that's your thing and you want to be able to flat screen game. it's probably not going to be the best experience for you, simply because you're probably going to be running into crashes and bugs and latency issues and occasional reboots possibly. All of these are very possible issues that you're probably going to run into at some point if you're trying to game on this game over something like this. For the same thing, you might even run into occasional issues if you do a lot of game development or other sort of software development and you're trying to do something like this. Or even if you're a programmer and you're looking at a lot of text all day, you're reading C++ code, C#, and you're writing lots of code, Python, whatever. All this kind of stuff can be a little bit more tedious to do on an index, but you might find something like browsing around on YouTube isn't quite as bad. Browsing certain websites might not be as bad if they're not specifically text-based websites. All these are not terrible experiences, they're just not the best that they could be, and I'm sure one day these could be significantly better. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you guys think of this experiment? Is it something that you guys would try? Let me know if you guys maybe even have tried it, and if you guys ran into these similar issues and how you guys came across them. I'd genuinely be curious to know. And while you're down there, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. And with that, I'll see you in the next reality.